We're all getting excited about the upcoming Rubber Soul Super Deluxe Edition coming in October. Well, those of us who can actually afford it are. And tucked inside that shiny box is something that we've not seen in these packages before. Alongside the now customary discs, the remix overseen by Giles Martin, the mono mix, the studio outtakes. For the first time, we're getting the US Capitol Records version of Rubber Soul. But why? I mean, everyone knows that the Beatles' official discography is based on the UK releases. So why should I care about a version that wasn't even approved by the band? Well, you'd be right to ask. But the US Rubber Soul has some genuinely unique and significant differences, and any Beatles fan will want to hear this historically important twist on an extraordinary album. So let's get into why the Capitol version of Rubber Soul absolutely deserves your attention. Hello, and welcome to Apple Jams, your Beatles and solo Beatles hangout. I'm so glad to see you here, so glad you could come. I have one little baby request, and that is, if you would, please me by smashing a like on this video and subscribing if you haven't already. That would really help me if you can. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait, Rubber Soul was different in the States? Yes, very. Until the releases were unified with Sgt. Pepper, every Beatles album had different track lists between the UK Parlophone versions and the US Capitol versions. Sometimes they had even different titles. Capitol's execs chopped and changed track lists to squeeze as much product out of the catalogue as possible. So shorter, reworked albums, some singles thrown in, B-sides repurposed, and additional compilations created like Something New, Yesterday and Today, and The Early Beatles, none of which had any creative input from the band. Check out this incredible infographic created by blogger Jared Pike, which shows clearly which tracks were taken from which UK release to create the US versions. This is a great piece of work, and there'll be a link to Jared's website in the description of the video, where he does a really comprehensive deep dive into the history, which is so worth a watch, so go and check it out. There was a business reason behind all this butchery. US royalties were paid per song, whilst UK royalties were paid as a percentage of the wholesale album price. So fewer songs meant cheaper manufacturing and more leftovers to slap onto future albums. More albums, of course, means more album sales. Win-win for Capitol, not so win-win for the Beatles' artistic intent. Initially, of course, the Beatles would have been quite happy to crack America by whatever way possible. And as much as they put plenty of work into their album tracks, their focus, like the wider industry, was still on singles. But by the time Rubber Soul and Revolver came around, the album had started to become a much more prominent artistic statement, thanks to standout records such as Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited, the Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man, and the Beach Boys' Today. Albums that proved a long-form record could have a unified mood, identity, and creative purpose. The Beatles started to notice this trend, as indeed they were involved in pushing it, and started to become frustrated with Capitol's manipulation of their work, infamously expressed on the legendary Butcher cover, which Yesterday and Today was initially released with. Revolver was the last album to get this treatment. The US version wasn't wildly different to the UK one, just shorter, omitting I'm Only Sleeping, And Your Bird Can Sing and Dr. Robert, all of which strangely were released before Revolver came out on either side of the pond, on the aforementioned Yesterday and Today. All Lennon songs as well, if you hadn't noticed, leaving the subsequent US version of Revolver noticeably more McCartney-led, something that would likely have irritated John Lennon. Rubber Soul, though, that's where things get really interesting. Capitol didn't just shorten it, they completely reshaped it. In 1965, America's folk rock scene was booming. Dylan, the Byrds, Simon and Garfunkel. Capitol saw an opportunity. With a few Beatles tracks already leaning towards a folk or folk rock sound, they doubled down, adding leftovers that fit that vibe and removing songs that didn't. The result? A different album, a different mood, a very different Rubber Soul. Let's rewind a little. The US version of Help was a very different beast compared to the UK version. In America, it was released as a strict film soundtrack, just like the US version of A Hard Day's Night before it. The UK versions, meanwhile, were full-on Beatles albums. all the songs from the film, plus additional tracks recorded during the same sessions. Capitol had already pulled several of those non-film songs for Beatles 6, which meant that 4 UK help tracks were still unused in the US discography, and therefore available for Capitol to repurpose when assembling the US Rubber Soul. Those 4 leftovers were Act Naturally, It's Only Love, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday. 2 of these, It's Only Love and I've Just Seen a Face, were folded onto the US Rubber Soul to push the album further into the folk rock direction that Capitol wanted. The other 2, Act Naturally and Yesterday, were held back for Yesterday and Today. But of course, Capitol couldn't simply bolt these leftover help tracks onto Rubber Soul and call it a day. That would have meant paying royalties on more songs, which was, let's be honest, never their style. Something had to give, and with one eye firmly on that folk rock boom of 1965, Capitol saw an opportunity to reshape the album's entire flavour. So which songs got the chop? Well, some pretty seismic decisions were made. First up, Drive My Car, axed as the opening track. Now that's a huge move. The opener sets the tone for the whole album, and Drive My Car is a punchy, witty, R&B leaning rocker with bright guitars, swagger, and humour. It's nothing like folk rock. Removing it makes sense if your goal is to steer the album towards something earthier and more acoustic. In its place, Capitol chose I've Just Seen a Face, a bold decision considering it wasn't even on the UK Rubber Soul. But stylistically, well, it's perfect for the direction that they wanted. Skiffle-driven, breathless, acoustic, full of that rustic, rootsy energy that chimed nicely with the American folk rock movement. Next up, an absolutely huge call, the removal of Nowhere Man. For me, this song is central to what makes Rubber Soul such a landmark album. Those incredibly refined 3-part harmonies, the chiming, jangly guitar phrases, and lyrics that feel both expansive and introspective at the same time. And honestly, I'd argue it already carries a folky, contemplative feel that wouldn't have clashed with the direction that Capitol was chasing. Nevertheless, Capitol took it off. It's a massive decision when you think about it. Nowhere Man isn't just a great track, although it absolutely is. It's one of the emotional pillars of the UK album. Removing it doesn't just tweak the vibe, it fundamentally reshapes the album's centre of gravity. Next up, another notable cut, What Goes On. And it's a bit of a shame for Ringo. This removal means that he no longer has a vocal lead on the US version of Rubber Soul. This isn't a decision that really weakens the American version. I mean, if anything, you could argue it tightens the album. What Goes On is a charming track, but it's undeniably an album filler and a Ringo showcase more than it is a core track. Its vibe leans far more to country than folk rock. It's got that easy shuffle, twangy guitar lines, and a light-hearted, almost rockabilly feel. Lovely in its own way, but not aligned with the earthy, acoustic, introspective flavour that Capitol was trying to engineer. And its replacement? Well, it's hard to argue that it didn't make sense. It's Only Love is a far better fit for the folk rock flavour. It's built on strummed acoustic guitars rather than electric twang. It has a gentler rhythmic feel as opposed to a country shuffle. It's melodically more reflective. And lyrically, it's emotionally sensitive and raw rather than being light-hearted. In other words, it ticks every box Capitol wanted to emphasise. So while losing Ringo's vocal spot is a shame, swapping in It's Only Love actually strengthens the US album's cohesion. It helps continue the illusion that Rubber Soul was always meant to be a warm, acoustic-leaning, folk rock-adjacent record, even though that wasn't remotely the Beatles' intention. If I Needed Someone's removal from Rubber Soul is honestly a little bit strange to me. Given the breakthrough of the Byrds with their folk rock take on Mr. Tambourine Man, you'd think this similarly jangly, chiming, upbeat Harrison track would be a shoo-in for inclusion. In many ways, it's the Beatles' most direct engagement with that sound. But when you look at the other songs that Capitol removed, Drive My Car, Nowhere Man, What Goes On, well, you start to see a pattern. It's possible Capitol wasn't aiming for folk rock in the broader Byrds-style sense at all. Instead, they seem to be leaning towards a more intimate, singer-songwriter, earthy acoustic-led direction. less band-driven jangle, more fireside strumming. In that context, If I Needed Someone suddenly becomes the odd one out. It's electric, it's built on ringing guitar chimes, and it has a cool band-led groove rather than the rustic, skiffle-tinged acoustic vibe that Capitol was trying to emphasise. So while the cut is bold, and to be honest, still feels counterintuitive to me, you can see the logic behind it. And honestly, I'd love to know George's take on it, because If I Needed Someone is categorically his strongest song to date. Confident, melodically assured, harmonically rich, and fully realised. For me, it's the moment when he finally steps up as a songwriter on an equal footing with Lennon and McCartney. Rubber Soul is absolutely not the same without it, and its absence leaves a noticeable difference to the US version's personality. So we've explored the tracklist differences, but we're not done yet. It turns out that even the songs themselves differ between the UK and US versions. It's not enough to make a playlist of UK tracks in the US running order, no sir. You still haven't heard Rubber Soul the way American listeners heard it in 1965. First things first, the US versions tended to have added reverb, a mastering tweak Capitol often applied because they believed it suited the American market. But the changes don't end there. The first overt difference you'll notice is on the word. The Capitol version uses a different mix to the UK release, and it's immediately obvious in the sections where John sings solo, like, "Now that I know what I feel must be right, I'm here to show everybody the light," giving his vocal a fuller, more blended sound. Honestly, I actually really like it. It's a sensible amendment, and I wouldn't have minded it being on the UK version. It smooths the transition between the big, full-on harmonies of the refrain and John's solo lines, so his vocal doesn't suddenly feel exposed. But there's one aspect of the US mix that drives me absolutely mad. In the second half of the song, there's a high harmony that Capitol's mix pulls out and isolates. It sits all on its own in the left channel, with the rest of the vocals in the right. That harmony is present on the UK mix, but it's blended much more subtly. Once you hear it separated like this, you can't unhear it. It completely ruins the vocal blend. It's most obvious at about 1 minute 39. Give the word a chance to say. And finally, the fade out. On the US version, it comes in much more abruptly than the UK mix. If you're used to the longer, smoother UK fade, then the Capitol version feels like someone just yanked the fader down. Another unmistakable difference is on I'm Looking Through You. The US version includes 2 false starts, little acoustic stumbles before the song properly kicks in. They're not on the UK mix at all, and they immediately give the track a more rootsy, homemade, band warming up kind of vibe. In the context of Capitol's folk-leaning agenda, it's not a bad call. Those false starts subtly reinforce the acoustic, informal, earthy flavour that they were trying to emphasise across the whole album. It's the kind of thing that makes the record feel a bit more intimate, a bit more spontaneous, again, even though the Beatles never intended that. The song itself is identical once it gets going, but it does mean that if you're used to the UK version, the US one has this charming, slightly scruffy pre-roll that signals a different Rubber Soul to the one you're used to. But why should you care? Yes, the Rubber Soul that the Americans got is different, but the catalogue was standardised in the 1980s, and the UK albums were cemented as the definitive canon. So surely there's no real point in hearing a version of a fantastic album that now exists only as a curious historical footnote. Well, that depends on how much you care about music history, because there are 2 huge reasons why the US Rubber Soul still matters. First of all, this is the version that Americans embraced, and cracking the American market wasn't just a commercial milestone for the Beatles, it was a crucial cultural one. America was the world's biggest music market, the centre of pop culture gravity. The Beatles becoming a phenomenon there is what cemented their status as an internationally significant force. And the album Americans fell in love with wasn't the UK Rubber Soul, it was this one. Second, this is the version that influenced their peers. The Beatles weren't just shaping British pop, they were shaping American rock, folk and psychedelia. And the musicians who were listening in 1965 weren't hearing the UK album. They were hearing Capitol's acoustic leaning, folk rock tilted Rubber Soul. That's the version that inspired countless American performers across rock, pop, folk, and beyond. Take the Beach Boys' Brian Wilson, for example. When he heard Rubber Soul, he was electrified, determined to better the Beatles. That spark pushed him to create Pet Sounds, one of the most important albums ever made. And Pet Sounds, in turn, pushed the Beatles to raise their own bar, leading directly to Sgt. Pepper. So in a roundabout way, it's the American Rubber Soul, not the UK one, that helped set off this chain reaction that gave us Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper, two of the greatest albums of all time. And that's why it's worth hearing. Not because it's better, but because it's historically consequential. It's the version that changed the world. So let me know down in the comments, which is your Rubber Soul? Have you ever heard the other side's version? If you're American, chances are you're now living with the standardised UK album. But for UK listeners, the number of people who've actually heard the US version is probably much, much smaller, which makes its inclusion in the upcoming Super Deluxe box set a genuinely tantalising prospect. I'd be interested too in any thoughts you might have on the album cover, because this is one of the rare moments of symmetry between the UK and US versions. We haven't seen this since With the Beatles and Meet the Beatles, which famously shared the same cover, despite being totally different albums. There are differences though. The American version has noticeably muted colours and a brighter, slightly washed out exposure, whereas the UK version is much more dialed up in saturation, with deeper greens and richer tones, most noticeably in the deep orange of the logo. It's subtle, but once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. Your preference will almost certainly line up with whichever version is yours. And as with the album itself, there's no right or wrong way to experience this seminal piece of work. Thanks for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you ring the bell to ensure that you get notified of new videos, because I'm not done talking about Rubber Soul just yet. And with all that said, all that's left to say is, ta-ra for now, and thanks for watching.